good evening everybody, and welcome along to our webinar tonight, which is Spearfishing for Kingfish in Sydney with Neil Dorrian from Spearfishing Australia. Most of you are already pretty familiar with Neil, but I thought I'd give you all a quick introduction. Neil is based here on the Northern Beaches in Sydney. He's had a huge career in diving and spearing industries in both New Zealand and Australia. He started spearfishing over 30 years ago, and for the last 20 years has been representing a range of spearfishing brands, including Andre, Omar, Sporasub, Immersion, and Cressy. And for more than 15 years has been representing Rob Allen. Today, he is the brand manager for Spearfishing Australia, who distribute Rob Allen, Salvamar, Pelagic, Ocean Hunter, and more. So thank you so much for joining us tonight, Neil. I'm going to pass it over to you and let you get started.
Thanks very much, Carmen. Can everybody hear me? All working? Thank you, Carmen. So tonight we're going to talk about everything spearfishing. As Carmen's mentioned, feel free to ask any questions via the chat box as we go through. We're going to talk about the equipment required for spearfishing, give you an idea on where to look in your local area. It's going to be mostly Sydney specific, but I'll try to give you a little bit of an insight into some of the other areas that I am familiar with in the New South Wales area in particular, and if there's any questions as well. Give techniques that may help in getting more results with spearfishing. I'll give you a little bit of an idea on the fight that you have with the kingfish and how to handle the fish once you've speared it, and then go from there and talk about any questions that you may have with regard to kingfish. So first of all, just a little bit about the kingfish. Look, it's fairly widespread in the Indo-Pacific area and very common in New Zealand, in the southern area of Australia, of course. It's also found in South Africa, southwestern America, and down into western Mexico. It's a fast-growing fish. At 1 year of age, they're approximately 50 centimetres long, and they grow about 10 centimetres a year. An 80 centimetre kingfish will weigh on average around 8 kilos and will be 4 years of age at that stage. It's considered a long-lived fish, with the largest caught on line actually in New Zealand was a 52 kilo. In fact, I've had a couple of fish speared over there, caught over there over 52 kilos. But here in Australia, the largest speared was actually up at Seal Rocks and was a 42 kilo kingfish. So there's certainly some great kingies around. That was in the 1980s. And I reckon we may be heading towards another record fish in the next few years, because the population is certainly, well, they're getting bigger. I don't know if the population is increasing, but the fish seem to be getting bigger and bigger each year. So first of all, let's talk about the equipment required to spear a kingfish. And in reality, you can almost use any spear gun if you got lucky, or even possibly a hand spear. But there are some spear guns that are going to give you better results. And typically I use in Sydney a 110 centimetre long spear gun with a twin rubber configuration. I like using twin rubbers just because I get more power from it. I use a 110 because I tend to find in Sydney we haven't always got great visibility. So it's a gun that is going to give me maneuverability in the shallows. It's going to give me enough power, and it's not going to be too long when the vis isn't great. So I'll just quickly show you the gun that I use. So this is just a Rob Allen with twin 40 rubbers, 7mm shaft. I actually use this gun with a reel. But I wouldn't recommend that you use a reel to start with for kingfish. The other setup that I use in Sydney is this gun here. I use this further north as well. This is a 1.3 Samburu. It's not set up with a reel, just set up with a standard handle configuration. They're both Rob Allen guns. I prefer to stay with the same gun, so the trigger's the same across the spear guns I use. Another option that you could use, so that's a 1.3, and it really comes down to your your clarity of water. If you're diving in clear water and further offshore for kingfish and other species, then I'd recommend you go up to a 1.2, 1.3, or even possibly a 1.4, which is a good all-rounder for further north and in the tropics as well. The other option that you'd go towards would be a roller gun, and the roller, you could use anything from an 80 centimetre, which is going to give you about the power of a single rubbered 1.2. Probably I would prefer to go up to a 90 or 100 roller, just to give you that little bit of extra power. So this roller here is a 100, which I've used a fair bit in New Zealand. I do recommend, though, that you look towards trying to keep the same type of spear gun that you're using. Switching between a conventional rubber and a roller gun can be a little bit problematic because they do fire differently. The roller gun doesn't have any recoil, and the standard power guns do. So it does take a little bit of time to get used to using the two. So you've got your gun. Then I just use a traditional float rope without a bungee. And the reason I don't use a bungee is that I don't like losing control of the fish, which you can also occurs with the reels to a certain extent. But by having a bungee, particularly a longer one, it allows the fish to keep on stretching and potentially pulling your equipment down to the reef. And we'll talk about this a little bit more later, but kingfish have this propensity to want to go straight to the bottom and tangle your gear up. So I tend to just use a straight float rope and a float that is foam filled. If you spear a big kingfish, anything sort of over 20 kilos, it will very easily pull your float down. So a 7 litre up to 12 litre foam filled float, and or a 3 atmosphere float, which you can use for other forms of blue water spearfishing as well. You saw that my spear gun had a reel. I recommend a lot of people do target kingfish with reels nowadays, and it is fun diving that way. Bear in mind that you still need to have a float and float rope sort of secured near you so the boat traffic stays away with the flag. But the problem with a reel is that you can get into problems with kingfish. They do fight very strongly, and if you're using a, you do lose control of being able to stop that fish easily. So you've got to be a lot more careful with shot placement if you are spearing kingfish with a reel. It's very easy for them to take line, get to the bottom of the reef, tangle you up, and you're in all sorts of problems. So that's one thing to bear in mind. I suggest you start without a reel and then work up towards that as you get more experience and get better with your aiming. The other piece of equipment that I take with me quite regularly when I'm going after kingfish is a teaser. The new one from Rob Allen I particularly like. It just comes in this, got a bait ball flasher, just comes in this little sealed container, so you can actually take it on a shore dive nice and easily. The other teasers tend to be quite cumbersome to launch from a shore dive, but this one floats, it can be attached to your float, and then when you get to an area where there's bait and fish, you just simply open up the teaser, take out your flasher, connect it to the float, and you've got your little portable teaser. They do work incredibly well, particularly when the fish are actively hunting. And you do find with kingfish that sometimes they are very active and they'll come straight up to you and come straight up to the teaser. And other days they can actually be quite aloof and a lot harder to spear. So it is just one of the strange things with kingfish, but you'll get your days when they're absolutely on. And on those days, the flasher will work in your favour, particularly if you're diving with somebody that doesn't have one. The fish will tend to come to you rather than them. So it's definitely worthwhile using. So on to where to look. I won't talk about the rest of the equipment because it just really comes down to your basics, wetsuits, masks, snorkels, that sort of stuff, which I assume you would have at the stage. As far as where to look, at this time of the year, if you're Sydney based, is the time of the year where the kingfish are moving down the coast from up north, and they really do hug the coast, and you do get a lot of opportunity for very big kingfish in very shallow water. So I often hear stories at this time of the year where people are going for crayfish because there's still good crays around, and they turn around and here's a 20, 25 kilo kingfish that's just cruising past and gives them a heck of a fright. So it is a really good time to be targeting kingfish because they are in their shallowest and in their closest to shore. Look in areas where there are bait, sort of a favourite reef, and there tends to hold a lot of bait. Then at various times of the day when kingfish are feeding, they'll be going through and eating that those yakas, or eating that bait. So it's an obvious place to target areas where there are bait. If you're not sure of areas that hold bait, then you've just got to put some time in. But obvious places include, if there's current and you're on a reef that's further offshore, head up current, and generally there's bait at the front end of the reef, and there's often also bait at the bottom end of the reef as well. But I generally move up current to the end of the reef and start my diving there. Headlands are a favourite haunt for kingfish, so head out to any headland. Generally you'll find bait on the way, and dive around that bait. Also look for areas where there's sort of foam or fizz heading out to sea. It's always a really good place. It tends to hold a lot of reef species, and with reef species you end up with bait and you get that whole sort of ecosystem of fish happening. So it's definitely an area that's well worth it. You'll come across them probably every 200 or 300 meters as you're swimming along a stretch of coastal reef, and it will always be one of the fishiest areas to look at. The other common place is just along the reef edge. So where the reef hits the sand, you'll often find that kingfish will come from the sand onto the reef and attack the bait. And sometimes they come from the top of the reef and down onto the sand line. So it's always worthwhile hanging along that reef edge.
Before you go on next, we just had a question about what times they're typically feeding at: sunrise, sunset, tides, things like that.
Look, I don't tend to get too focused on the tide, but I've found early morning as the summer progresses, they do tend to be more along the sort of shallow areas of the coast. I've often experienced kingfish in the shallows, say off the back of the Bower, Shelley Beach, where you walk down the cliff there. I often find that the kingfish are right up in the shallows at the beginning of the morning. I do like the tide coming up to high, but I don't really have the luxury of choosing that tide with the amount of time I've got to go spearing. So I'm just tend to be out there and try to put as much time on the day that I have. But on an incoming tide up to high tide, before high tide is typically good, and then on the next hour or so after the high tide as well. All right. As far as the technique for kingfish, this does vary a little bit on the day, because you do have days, like I've already mentioned, where the kingfish are really active. And it's fantastic when you're out there on days like that, because you tend to find the school will come around on a regular basis. They'll come right up to you. They'll give you the luxury of taking a shot quite easily. And then you'll have other days where they are a lot more cautious, almost aloof, and don't really want to come near you. On days when they're more active, teasers do help a little bit, but they'll generally come to you anyway. On the days when they are more aloof, then some techniques work quite well. One I've found works very well is if you're diving with somebody else and say you spear another fish like an Australian salmon, the action of that fish vibrating and hurt through the water will really attract other kingfish. And that's an ideal time. I often encourage somebody that's with me to spear something else and just hang there and wait in anticipation to get the kingfish. So it's quite a good thing to do. Take turns to shoot something like an Australian salmon, or a fish that's going to create the sort of vibrations. Some people just spear bait as well, which does work. Spear yakas, obviously they take a little more for careful aim, but the vibration does work. Some people use burley. I've never really bothered using burley for kingfish, but a lot of people do head out and use a fair bit of burley to attract them. I tend to find if the fish aren't acting interested and or disinterested and somewhat aloof, that if you don't act interested towards them, that often works as well. So rather than trying to swim down a kingfish, which you're never going to do, once they see that you're tracking them down and swimming aggressively towards them, they're just going to swim further away. So it may seem a little bit strange, but I've found and had some very good results by just turning my back on the fish altogether. Just turning my back on it and just having my gun out completely away from it. And you'll be surprised the number of times that a kingfish turns around and then just comes right over the top of your shoulder because you haven't acted aggressively towards that fish. You've actually acted the opposite. You've acted a little bit more timid towards it. So it's become more curious and headed in your direction. So it's definitely a technique that's worth trying. Trust me, you're not gonna swim down the fish, so you might as well try something a little bit different if you haven't got any hope in closing the gap. So keep work as a team as much as possible. I was diving with Carmen and Fabio a few months ago now, and we weren't really working as a team as well as we could, and didn't even talk about the protocol of if somebody speared a fish, and Fabio speared a fish. I wasn't even sure if he wanted me to second shoot it, so I sort of let him pull it up, and that got off, and we ended out with no fish. So, you know, you need to have an agreement on what you do. Some people don't mind you second spearing a fish. I certainly don't mind, and Fabio certainly let me know after that day he doesn't mind either. So second spearing a fish, I think, is fair, and I think is a good thing to do because it secures the fish, and we all go home and can share the fish. But so that's something to determine to do. You often find when one kingfish is speared that other kingfish will come around and hang around the fish as well. So if you want to work well together as a team and get better results, then by just spearing the fish, if you can hold it off the bottom and you know you've placed a good shot, other fish will come along and be able to maybe 2 or 3 if there's more of you, quality fish. Try to keep diving as much as possible. I've been out with a few people that are targeting kingfish, and I think they tend to just float on the surface thinking that the fish are going to come from the bottom up to them all the time. And I have speared a lot more kingfish on the bottom with the fish coming to me than being on the surface waiting for the fish to come towards me. So breathe up, go through your normal free dive protocol, spend some bottom time, and you'll get better results. I wish I had one of those bolters. Very nice. You'll get much better results doing that than just spending time on the surface and hoping that the fish will come along. What else? Yeah, when you're diving with bottom time, I find sometimes thumbing the rubber, so you're getting that sort of creating that vibration as you dive works very, very well as well. So just creating some vibration, a little bit of noise, and camouflaging yourself in the reef so the kingfish hears the noise, hears the sound, isn't really sure what it is, and comes in close for investigation. So that's sort of ambush type spearfishing. I think it's one of the more effective ways to get kingfish. Works better when you have a reel and you don't have your float line there. But the kingfish are inquisitive enough that they won't mind the float rope there as well, which I wouldn't recommend that technique for snapper.
Sorry, just before you go in, Neil, sorry, I've got another question for you. Just going back to talking about the breathe up, breathing up and obviously diving down. Ben Hell has just asked, what sort of depth are you talking about? What kind of depth of dive, basically?
Well, I would say with kingfish, you kind of need to be, working at the depth that you see they're at. But typically, I would be saying, up to 10 meters, and spending some good quality bottom time at 10 meters. Like if you breathe up, unless you've got a very good breath hold, you're not going to spend a lot of bottom time at 20 or 25 meters, but you can spend quite good time at 10 meters. And you tend to find, I get a lot of good results around that sort of 10 meter mark with kingfish coming in anyway. So So just a good breather, reasonable bottom time, and I think you'll find you'll get better results than just spending all day on the surface working the teaser and hoping the school sort of gets the interest to come along and then come up to you. Half the time what happens when you see the school from the surface, particularly if they're in that flighty mode, is that you do the dive, they spook, you don't get any results, where when you're on the bottom and the fish haven't necessarily seen you, they will often come right up to you and you'll get a reasonable shot.
Awesome, thank you.
No worries. So we've found our kingy and we're about to take the shot. So typically I try to spear it along the sort of lateral line. I tend to find that gives a much better securing shot, more towards the head if I can, sort of through the pec fin and out through the gill plate. I find is a really secure shot. I notice a lot of people when they are going for their first kingies, they tend to lose a few by getting a little bit excited and not letting the fish close the gap and firing too early. So they hit the fish, but the fish are often a lot thicker than what they used to. Shaft doesn't penetrate all the way through and it takes you for a very short run and then rips out. So be aware of that. Let the fish close the gap. Generally, they'll come in straight towards you, turn sideways and give you a few seconds to take the shot before they move back off in the same direction. So just bear that in mind. Try to avoid the gut cavity. I still have landed fish shot through the gut before, no problems at all. Not always the best shot in the world, but you just need to be a lot more cautious when you have shot a fish low because they can rip out. And as I mentioned before, they do fight quite dirty, so they're going to try to get to the bottom. You're going to try to pull them off the bottom and keep them off the bottom, but by doing that, sometimes you tear the fish further as well. So if you're shooting it through the lateral line or a little bit higher, you often can put a lot more pressure on the fish. If you shoot it too low, you can't put as much pressure on it, and then often it will tear off when it gets to the bottom anyway. And as I mentioned, look for those shots that the shaft penetrates right through and you've got the flopper or the barb toggling on the other side of the fish. That's sort of your classic hold shot. Once you have speared the fish is when the fun really begins, because they are an incredibly strong fish to tackle. Even a 10 kilo kingy is going to give you a pretty good fight. They're not up to dogtooth tuna standard, but they're pretty impressive. I always find I'm amazed at how strong they can be. You spear a 20 kilo kingfish and you try to bring it up off the bottom, you've got no hope. Even if you're quite strong, the fish will keep on pulling you down. So you've got to be a little bit aware of that, and that can be a real trap for people that are getting confident with their diving, thinking that I'm in 20 meters of water, I'm going to drag that kingfish up to the surface because I don't want to lose it to the reef. And they find themselves in a dangerous circumstance, potential blackout, shallow water blackout, by really pushing the limits, using a lot of energy to get the fish to the surface. So that's where you need your teamwork, you need your buddy helping with the float. Sorry, pushing more buttons there. Is that still working, Carmen? Yeah.
Yep, you're good. You're good.
Sorry, leaning on my screen. So yeah, working as a team and ensuring that you land the fish. So what the kingfish tends to do, the minute you spear it, unless you hit it really hard and almost stone it, it's going to want to go straight to the bottom. So typically what I am trying to do the minute I spear it is kick upwards. If I'm using my reel, I'm holding onto the base of the reel to try to give some more tension on the drag to keep it off the bottom. If I'm using my float rope, which is the best situation in landing the fish or securing it, then normally the float rope, I let go of the gun and I'm holding onto the float rope, letting it run a little bit, but trying to put as much pressure as I can until I get to the surface. The minute I'm on the surface, I'm taking a couple of deep breaths and I'm starting to really kick hard, and I'm pulling up with the float rope. I'm trying to put as much pressure on that fish as I possibly can, as quickly as I can, to keep it off the bottom. If the fish gets to the bottom, then you've probably got, if it's a big fish, a 50-50 chance of landing it, because they'll tear around the reef, they'll break the mono, they'll just use the leverage of the shaft getting caught to rip themselves in half to escape. They really do fight to that level. They'll kill themselves to get off the end of the shaft. So try to keep them off the bottom under all circumstances, but obviously you need to get to the surface as your number one objective before anything else. Once you've got the fish, if sometimes, you know, I've had fights which, you know, it's a blur, but you know, maybe last 20 minutes for a big kingfish. So it can take quite a while to get the fish tight enough and up to the surface. And once you've got it close, you've got to be pretty cautious at that stage, because if you're using a reel, it can get very messy because there's line and stuff all over the place. But even with your monofilament, you've got to be careful that you don't wrap the monofilament around you, because the fish may still have a fair bit of life and sound and drag you down with it. So typically what I try to do is get to the stage where I've got the shaft and it's a reasonably secure shot. I hold the shaft and then pull against the shaft and run my hand underneath the gills and hold onto the gills securely. And if it's a big kingy, then I wrap my legs around the tail. And then I wear my knife on my arm. So it's a matter of getting the knife from my arm, and I place a kill shot, with the knife directly on top of the head and about 2 inches back from the sort of eyes. So you're trying to sort of get in the vertebrae, in the sort of spine, and you'll feel when you hit that spot, the fish will vibrate, and you just keep on pushing in there, you're pretty much killed it then. And then I bleed the fish just so that I get the best quality meat from the fish. And generally, once I've got it on the boat, if I out my boat, then I put it straight onto ice. There are some instances of kingfish getting a little bit mushy, typically more in the northern areas. As you get into warmer waters, typically kingfish sort of like temperatures up to around 24, but not much hotter, but you do get them up in Coffs Harbour and places like that. And you do tend to find in those areas that they can get a little bit more mushy. I have heard from people up there that if you get them straight on the ice, that does help. I've only ever had a couple of mushy kingies down here in Sydney, but you certainly notice it from their eating qualities that, you know, it's not nice tasting compared to what kingfish normally is. You know, kingfish to me, it's my favourite fish to target down in Sydney. It's great eating qualities. Sashimi is really, really good. So, you know, it's an awesome fish to target, and probably our easiest to find and locate quality fish. So generally when I'm going out spearing Sydney, regardless of the time of the year, I'm targeting kingfish. They are more prevalent from October onwards. You tend to find the winter months, it can be a lot of hit and miss, and more miss than hit for kingfish. But with what we've just had, October come through, we've got good kingfish numbers again heading down the coast. And we'll get them all the way through now, through to May, June, before they disappear and go up north spawning or whatever they do up there. But you tend to find that the fishers get them further offshore during the winter in deeper reefs, so they go deeper, and we don't tend to get them as commonly close to our diveable reefs. But at this time of the year, as I've already mentioned a couple of times, it's our best opportunity to get, you know, quality large kingfish. Now, the size limit in New South Wales is 65 centimetres, so it's a fish that's only 2.5, 3 years old. Typically, I don't really target them until around 70, 75, and that size are quite good sashimi. The bag limit is 5 kingfish per day, so look, that's more than ample for anybody. I suggest that just taking 2 kingfish is more than enough for somebody, particularly if they're good size. But the bag limit is 5. But I just think fishing sustainably for the future, that 2 is more than enough on a daily basis. But that's all up to you. I think that's covered most of it, Carmen. Are there any questions?
All right, guys, if you have any questions, and ladies, any questions, pop them in the, just pop them in the chat, or say you got a question in the chat and I'll unmute you. Or has been too thorough this time. It's so funny. Sometimes you get bombarded, hey, Neil, and sometimes it's just quiet. Guys, any questions at all?
I've got a question. Can I verbalize it, or do I need to put it in the chat?
No, verbalize it. It's all good.
Oh, cool. That's easier. I'm a bit lazy. Speaking of lazy, this is probably why I don't catch many kingfish. It's probably because around Sydney, I'm going out to try and get a feed. I'd love to catch kingfish all day, but it's easier to catch, a couple of drummer or Ludwig mowies.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of, I feel like most of my diving's focused towards the shore and not out towards the shore where the kings are. And I kind of feel like if you're either fishing for kingfish or you're fishing for reef fish, maybe you can change my mind or that, give you a bit more optimism.
Yeah, look, where you're getting the reef fish, you'll get kingies as well, certainly at this time of the year. But you definitely will get better results if you are focusing and targeting on the one species. In saying that, as I mentioned before, I don't mind if someone's spearing other fish around me, because I often find it enhances the opportunity of a kingy coming by. But yeah, I mean, where do you spear mostly?
Oh, I'm down in the Shire, so everywhere from Kurnell down to Royal National Park. Yeah, mostly around that area. So, yeah, Boat Harbour's an easy one because there's a good mixed bag out there. So you kind of Boat Harbour, you're on the inside of the reef and you get some good reef stuff, and on the outside you feel like you've got a better chance of getting some kings, but not a lot of reef fish options as well, just depending on the weather.
Yeah, I'd say I don't spear a lot down that way, being more based on northern beaches, but I'd say, those sort of headlands as you're going out of Botany Bay there would be definitely a good place to look. And Boat Harbour out off the front section of that as well. And yeah, just really look for good areas of bait. If you know some bait grounds, typically you're going to find them off headlands and stuff like that, and just go out with a bit of a mission and a bit of a focus on and going after kingies for the day. Just map out a place and look for a headland, and I don't know if you've got a dive buddy that you go with, but it's a good way to dive with somebody else. Head out to a headland and just focus on that species, and just remember to try to keep your diving up. If you've got a buddy, one up, one down, and get some bottom time, and I'm sure after a couple of times you mightn't get the first time, but you'll see kingfish and you'll get your first result. But and then, like anything, you just get a lot more addicted to that. Like, I often get accused of going out for an armed snorkeling expedition because I'm only focusing on kingfish, and as a result of that, I don't come home with anything, because I'm targeting that one species. So it's good that you're getting home and getting a feed with what you're doing. But if you wanted to go after kingfish, then it's probably time to target those and forget about the drummer and the Ludwig and stuff for at least one dive. But like, there's nothing to be said. You might go out next time and have a spear and a Ludwig, and then get to the surface and there's these dirty, great big torpedoes all swimming around you, because at this time of the year, they are in shallow water often, and they pretty much hug the coast. So it's just a matter of being out there, right place, right time. If you look at the Sydney sort of topography, those fish are heading from north and they're swimming along the coast. So anywhere where you're out front on the rock somewhere, at some stage, those fish are going to be swimming past.
Nice one. So what you're saying is my dive buddy isn't shooting enough reef fish to attract kingfish for me to shoot. So that's his fault. That's you, Peter. I know you're on here, mate. Thanks, Neil.
Nice.
Awesome. Floyd and James, do you guys want to unmute yourself, because you guys have got a couple of questions there? Why not? Okay.
Hello. Really enjoyed this so far. Thanks for this. Looking forward to the snapper one. I guess we had a couple questions. One of them was, is it better to stay in one spot, haunt like a particular structure, or to cover ground? Then there was another one of, I had another one.
Tell us your craziest story.
Yeah. Rowdy King story, I think it was.
And
Yeah. So as far as staying in one spot or covering more ground, look, there's different schools of thought on this. I get bored staying in one spot, so I just got to cover more territory. It's not necessarily always the best thing to do, because there is the argument of leaving fish to find other fish, and you know, if I was in a spot and it was performing and I could see kingfish regularly coming through, then I typically would stay. But if it's a bit dead, then I typically move on. And I've heard, you know, particularly in long reef where I go a bit, you know, sometimes I'll leave and then people will get good fish later on in the day, and you think, oh, should have I stayed? But I typically, you know, head from boat, and I might do 5 or 6 different spots in a day. Yeah, it's really up to you. But personally, as a diver, I do get a little bit bored just staying in that one spot. But if you've got a spot that delivers constantly and you're getting good results there, I'd be going there first and seeing if they're on, and spending some quality time there before I moved on. So, my craziest kingfish story, I've got quite a sad one, really, which sad in a way for me, but I went on I go to New Zealand a fair bit, spearing over there, and went down to White Island where the volcano erupted a while ago, and went out on a boat there called Musa Charters. And we spent a day on White Island, and the charter operator, you're allowed 1 fish per person per day there. It's quite a good rule that they have there. So you've got to be really, really selective of your fish, right? We're there for trophy fish, or, you know, fish over 30 kilos is what we're sort of targeting. But anyway, first day went by and none of us shot any fish. So we went north the next day to Mare Island, another island system there, and we jump in, we're all pretty excited, and I swim over this reef structure, and here's this school of fish all in front of me. Can't help myself. Pull the trigger straight away and pull in a 10-kilo kingfish. My mate who's with me is laughing, going, mate, you've gone too early. You've gone too early. And I just didn't know what to do. I couldn't really drop that fish in. So I pulled in this little fish. Anyway, I dived the rest of the day, because the guy said, oh, if you see a record fish, you land a record fish. Anyway, didn't see a record fish, but on one of the dives, this monster kingfish came into me, and I screamed back to the surface, and my mate was there, and I said, mate, dive. So he dived straight down and shot a 38-kilo kingy. So that was a story of persistence, you know, and not going too early. But yeah, I've been there a few times as far as, and you know, there's some great big kingfish there. But the exciting thing locally is that we're starting to get some really big kingfish just here off Sydney, you know, similar to what they get in New Zealand. So it's really, really exciting time for you young guys getting into it, because I've never seen healthier or bigger kingfish in my time of spearing in Sydney than what we've got now. When I first started here, when all the fish traps were around, and they really decimated the kingfish population, and it was just a terrible time. You're lucky to see a kingfish when you're out there. So at the moment, the stocks are up. We're getting big fish and some good opportunities. As far as snapper stories, haven't got too many locally, but got some for New Zealand. But yeah, I wouldn't say I'm an expert snapper spearo in the Sydney area. It's pretty lean pickings here, mate.
Fairo. Thanks very much.
No worries.
Mike Battaglia, is it? Sorry if I pronounced that wrong. Do you want to unmute yourself and ask? Can you hear me?
You there?
Hey, how's it going?
Good. I spear the harbour, just around Middlehead and stuff like that. Is that a good place for kings? I've seen them there. Just rats, but I'm wondering if there's any advice for spearing the harbour.
Yeah, the harbour gets pretty good for kingies as you get further into the summer. So I wouldn't be going there necessarily early, but sort of around February, March is probably the best time. I've speared kingies in the harbour. Nothing super big, but up to 10 kilos on middle head, and friends of mine have got them up to 20 kilos in the harbour before. So, yeah, certainly at the right time of the year, you can get some really good results in the harbour spearing kingies.
Sweet, thank you.
Awesome.
No worries.
Any more questions? Thanks, Mike. Have we got any more questions? Last questions?
Yeah, I'll ask one.
Yeah,
I'm just interested, Neil, in how often you get, when you're spearing off Sydney, whether you ever have any interactions with sharks and whether that happens after you've shot a fish, and then also how that compares to, when you're somewhere totally different, like up the coast or down the coast.
Yeah, haven't had too many issues over the years at all in Sydney with sharks, but they are certainly, in my opinion, the numbers are on the increase, and pretty much on the increase, the same level of the whale population, because particularly great whites, feeding on the calves and on afterbirth and all that sort of stuff. So they get fed pretty well as the sharks run up the coast and down the coast, and the result, the population's increasing. So it's somewhat of a concern, but spearing off Sydney, I've never lost well, actually I did. I lost a kingfish last season to a grey nurse shark, but it already got off at that stage. Not had any issues in Sydney with sharks. Have had in New Zealand before with bronze whalers, with kingies. I tend to, my time I get a little bit nervous sometimes is when I've had a big fight with the kingy, and then you bleed it, and then there's just this big sort of expanse of blood around you. I like to really push the kingfish away at that stage and swim away a little bit from it. Yeah, haven't had too many issues in Sydney at all. Places like Seal Rocks are getting quite a bit sharkier. In fact, it's getting pretty full on up there. So you got to pick your time, and I dive up there a little bit by myself because I camp up there over the sort of Christmas period most years. But it's getting to that stage where I think it's probably not safe to spear by myself up there. But it's something that we all need to, I guess, consider as individuals, what your comfort levels are around it. There's certainly a risk associated with spearfishing and being in the water, future risk with sharks. It's a risk that I think is increasing, but it's not a risk that I think is to a level where I would say it's unsafe to spear by any stretch of the imagination. If you look at the amount of activity we've got in spearing, it's higher than it's ever been in my time in the industry, and we have very few attacks. We do have them most years, and fortunately in most of those instances they're not fatalities, but it's something we do need to be more cautious with, and I think working as a buddy pair does help that with that a little bit, for sure.